and not just hear, because all research tells us, of course, we remember more of what we see than what we just hear, especially if it's coming maybe from my mouth. But the ability to see what we're talking about. One of the things that I have done, and I just want to review very quickly what we've done for the first 3 weeks, and of course we were not able to be here last week, but we have several scriptures where we're able to see and know what God's purpose is for us. And when we're looking especially at 1 Corinthians 10:11, where it says, now these things happen for your instructions, and we can be able to see and know. We can be able to see and know what God wants us to have as an example. And they're written down for our instruction. That's very, very important. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 10. We can understand the word not by modernizing it, but by entering it. And how do we enter the Bible other than just really opening it up and really getting into it? Why did God want the people to know those things then? And as we've always talked about, we can look back now because everything's been revealed. We're not like the prophets writing down things that we didn't know what we were writing about. We can look, everything has been revealed to us. Everything that we need to know to be able to get to heaven. There's nothing that has been kept from us. Yeah, we're talking about imagining in the shoes. We're talking about Providence and U.S. history and the hard Jesus. And what I'm saying and trying to emphasize, the expectations that Jesus has for us are very, very high. And he had higher expectations for his apostles and his followers than he did of just the people who were listening and just following behind him a little bit. I'm still not able to advance and go back. So we've talked about Simon the Zealot and Matthew, as we've highlighted here. We've talked about Mary and Martha and some of the lessons that we've looked at. If we get to it today, I want to get to Noah. But in talking about Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector, from the hard Jesus standpoint, Jesus didn't solve things for them. Simon and Matthew could have been at each other's throats, because Simon was really anti-government. Matthew was working with the government, taking the kind of the soft or the comfortable way to exist. Jesus didn't solve their problems. He said, you follow me, you're going to be together, and you're going to fix it. I'm going to help you, but you're going to fix it. I'm not going to solve your problems for you. Most males today, we want to fix things, right? And I'm pointing at me. We want to get in and fix things. Do we muddle it up when we try to fix it a lot of times? Jesus didn't do that. He said, follow me, figure out that I'm your master. Change your master to me, and things will work out. I'm not going to fix it for you. With Mary and Martha, we emphasize the fact that Martha was serving from anxiety, and we emphasize that because Jesus said that. Mary has chosen the better portion. Martha was the one that was normal for the time, wasn't she? She was serving the people. She was serving everybody in her house. That was her really first priority as she saw it. There was a higher priority that Jesus complimented Mary on. So I want to talk today about providence in history, a little bit more and so on. And I'm going to pause here. And I would like to see a show of hands. If you really like history, and if you're a history lover and you want to know more about it, and when you get into it, I hadn't seen that before. If you're a history lover, would you let me know if you really like it? Okay, history's okay. I can take it or leave it. Who are you? How many of you hate history? I don't even want to talk about it. It's 2026, and I'm there, and I'm fine without it. It's okay to raise your hand in that case. I won't do this only in jest, okay? Um, I wanted to talk about Providence in history because I've read some things, and then I've read a few more things, and then a few more things, and it's tremendously intriguing to me. One of my challenges, and I recognize, I want to talk about all the points, and I have a hard time summarizing and bulleting, if you will. I just made that word up, rather than going to it in depth. So I'm going to try to summarize more than I have. And if it quenches a thirst for those who don't like history, fine. If it kind of makes you salivate a little bit, I would love that. But it's been said that a special providence watches over children, drunkards in the United States. People on the outside have looked in and made observations. We've looked at these scriptures in Daniel, Acts, Psalms, and Proverbs. And we have faith. We have the courage and commitment as Christians to trust God in working His will in all ways. Can we deepen that trust? Can we deepen that faith? I think we absolutely can. And if we see or notice different things, I hadn't really noticed that before. I think it can deepen our faith and make us appreciate what the Bible people have done, and then also from a secular standpoint, the freedoms that we have in the U.S., which are more than any other place, deepen our appreciation for those, and not just appreciation, but what can we do to preserve them and not get to the point where we lose a few of them. Did we lose a few of them in 2020? The answer is yes. I resented that. Personally, I did. And I want us to do, we have a vote. But what can we do, at least personally from our standpoint, to keep our convictions so that we can find ways to preserve those freedoms? I'm not talking about, moving on. We need to look and seek and recognize and acknowledge and accept the providence of God in a lot of places. And how do we recognize that? We've talked about that a little bit, and I'll summarize that before moving on. I believe that we can find a lot of instances in the U.S. history where pilgrims, colonizers, pioneers, and settlers looked for the providence of God. They invoked the providence of God, and they recognized God as being able and giving Him credit for the things that happened in their lives. Those are a personal basis that is not trying to say that government rules or that everything is approved, and we'll talk about this a little bit, and that God makes everything happen. I'm not trying to say that. But if we look for God working in our lives, and if we give God credit for working in our lives, that can deepen and personalize and commit our faith even stronger. That's what I'm trying to be able to talk about. It takes attentiveness, it takes intellectual inquiry, it takes discernment, intellectual honesty, and humility in looking for ways that God works for in our lives and in past history. I am not saying, and I'll go through this again, I'm not saying that you must see providence in all these things that happen or you're wrong. I'm not saying that. I am saying that if we're honest about patterns or things that come up, we need to at least pause and say, God may have really been involved in that, and it's not me that caused that. Providence is rarely proven in a single event. It's most often recognized in patterns that make sense when viewed backward. We can see a lot of things over time and saying, and we can do that in our personal lives, right? Can you look back when you were 25 years old and say, how did I get to that point? And what did I do right after that? Or whatever age it was, or how many times in your life. If this is a small group, I'd love to talk about some of those things. I mean, we can just see and recognize that in the past. And God accomplishes things through real, flawed people. Did He work more by miracles and more directly in the Bible times before the Bible is revealed to us in its written word? Absolutely, yes. But I still believe he works in a lot of ways, not in a miraculous way by him, unless he chooses in his way, but he works through people today. And then when people do dumb things like me, he's able to fix that a little bit and take care of some things. We talked about Adams and Jefferson, and one of the things, trying to rush, they both died on July the 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was sort of approved on July the 4th of 1776. That's at least coincidence. What was the life expectancy? I've tried to read, especially over the last 2 weeks, criticisms or explaining away a lot of things and saying, well, no, you can't do that. That's just coincidence. I've tried to look at it from another standpoint, not just the way I want to see things. What was the life expectancy of a male born in 1736? It was between 35 and 45 years. If you were born in 1736, your life expectancy was probably going to be between 35 and 45 years. How old was Adams when he died? 90 years old. How old was Jefferson when he died? I'm glad you asked. It was 83 years old. Now, if they get close to, and these people that try to explain that away, and this is my personal belief and so on and so forth, or opinion or whatever. If you get close to July the 4th, 1826, and you're Adams or Jefferson, yes, I'm going to try to make it. Whatever we can do, and we know how people have willed themselves in some cases, I'm going to live to whatever. And I think that is possible. Yeah, they get that far. But the very fact that they're 90 and 83, how did they live that long? It's at least coincidence. It may be symbolism. I don't really think so. It may be an accident. I don't think so. It may be providence. It's at least interesting. And then you add the fact that James Monroe died on July the 4th, 1831. The first four presidents to die died on July the 4th. It's just an interesting tidbit, at least. And I'm not saying that's a huge monumental thing, but it's interesting. So many in the past have looked for, recognized, credited, and humbly acknowledged providence. I'm thankful for that if I can see and read people who have the same type of conviction that maybe I have. Does it strengthen what I can believe? Does it strengthen my commitment? And it's at least good to be around people who think the same way and are willing to question each other. Not just go down the road and say, yeah, that's what I believe. Don't talk to me about questioning that. I think if when Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, 22, test or question everything, hold fast to that which is good, abstain from the very appearance of evil. I want to question things. I don't care how old I am. I want to say, why do I believe what I believe? It's not just my mom and dad's faith, especially from 50 plus years ago. But question and say, okay, shouldn't we look for those things, and then when we see them, have an attitude of responsibility, humility, and gratitude, as a writer in 1770-something said, in recognizing those things that happened at the start of our country. It's just at least interesting and things that we can look at. These are my observations, and I'm not trying to, haven't come from some other place, and I'm not trying to say that you have to see these, but I want us to recognize them. There was recognition or credit at the time when these things happened, and we can read them and see the writings of people who said it at the time, like Daniel Webster and a lot of other people that I read too much 2 weeks ago. But not just in retrospect. They were willing and unabashed. They were unashamed to write and to say it out loud and invoke God's providence and the things that happened at that time. There was little public opposition or resistance to their recognition of that in writing and in speaking. It was the culture of the time. There was no prevailing claim that this recognition of God's providence violated freedom or propriety. That was the culture of the time. In 1776, in 1775, in 1789, when Washington took over as president, that was the prevailing culture. Has it changed? And oh my, yes. I would like to, in talking about these things, strengthen our willingness to question where we are today and how we can be more positive and how we can be more open in the right type of setting to preserve our freedoms and not take them for granted. I ran those and this quote that I came up with in trying to describe where we were 250 years ago. I would like for us to have a more increased awareness of how we can maintain and preserve the freedoms that we have. In the founding era, public preferences to Providence by major leaders were broadly acceptable and commonly heard. Open cultural pushback against that general God language was limited, though there was a minority skeptical current that certainly existed at that time. I go by the 80-20 rule in a lot of things. 80%, like with this, 80% of things that were going on, yeah, that's good. There were 20% of people that said, well, I'm going to push back on that, either because of my personal beliefs or that can't be. Thomas Paine and Ethan Allen were two particular examples that wrote and said, well, this can't be too much. I look at it, I'm the 80%. I'm going to question why I am, but I want to have a stronger observation and a stronger commitment to an appreciation in our country of where we are. I want to summarize something. This is primarily from Peter Medved's book on the American Miracle, where he goes and talks about different historical happenings, events, and the writings, the comments, the commentary of the things that were going on at that time. Some very interesting thoughts. There was settlement of the United States only after there was religious reform and a lot of the Puritan and separatist movements in Europe in the 1500s, and then culminating with the settlement of the United States more in 1607 and 1620. As you know those dates, Jamestown, Plymouth, and all of those things. It's interesting to note that from the time that, and there's usually the watershed date of 1517, and I had to look it up again, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door. Okay, that's a lot of the, we've got to change things. We're in the wrong way. There's a move to purify religious thinking, if you will, and then it got to a point where a lot of people wanted to separate because they say, I can't purify what's there. I can't really reform that, so I'm going to separate. And that's really what the Pilgrims did when they moved to Holland out of England before they came and settled the U.S. in 1620. There's a providential type of questioning that why weren't settlements in the United States really successful for the 1607 Jamestown? And it could be that it would not be successful because they had a wrong foundation and that they were looking only for themselves. And if you look at U.S. history in Roanoke, and if you've looked at that, the settlement that Sir Walter Raleigh and others tried to was very unsuccessful. And still to this day, they do not know what happened to the people who were at Roanoke. Still don't know. There was not this is a fact, there was not a religious foundation to those settlements, and especially the Roanoke settlement, before 1607. The people who came in 1607 to Jamestown, was that hard? Absolutely. Most of them, more than the majority, did not survive. There were the Puritans more than that case. The Pilgrims who came in 1620 had a religious and a separatist and a purification type of a foundation to that. We're leaving. We can't live over here anymore. We're going someplace new. And their foundation was based on, I'm going to say, God-like principles. Settlement, it's a fact, settlement in the U.S. did not happen before that, but finally that they had that pocket, and it is based on a different foundation. Those people based it on a different foundation. They survived. You can call that providential or not. I choose to do that. When they were coming in 1620 especially, they wanted to leave a month and a half before they were able to. One of their ships did not float very well. They had to go back and fix it. They ended up only on the Mayflower, as we know in history. They expected about 30 days to get across the Atlantic. It took them over 60 days. Now, there's all sorts of physical things, obviously, that cause that. But where did they end up? They wanted to go to Virginia and kind of be under the supervision and approval of those who were already in Virginia. Where did they end up? We know that, right? Where? Cape Cod, Massachusetts. They're 250 miles north. Now, is that navigational failure or is that storm-driven bad luck? I kind of choose to say a providential reroute. Now, it doesn't have to be. You just kind of look at some of the things, and all of these things, kind of a succession of things. Why did they end up there? When they get to Massachusetts, and even before they got there, say, okay, we're behind schedule, and we know we're off course. They developed what's known as the Mayflower Compact, and we know that from history. Why did they come up with a compact? And it was based on some religious, spiritual principles. Okay, we're not going to be under the supervision. We're not going to be the oversight. There's not going to be anybody there. How are we going to work together? Because we may not all agree on all of the details and everything else. How are we going to work together once we get there? They had enough forethought to fix this and come up with this on the boat while they're getting over there. That's because I believe they had more of a spiritual background and a spiritual reason for leaving Europe and coming here. Okay, and that's after all that development over the 1500s. That's after all of the things that went wrong and delayed them getting here, but they had enough of what I'm calling a providential pivot to be able to establish some order from we're not even there yet, we don't know exactly where we're going to land, but how are we going to work together once we get there? And they had enough forethought and willingness and commitment to come up, okay, let's work together and we're going to put it down in writing. When they landed around in the Cape Cod area in that curlicue part of Massachusetts, you know your map and everything, when they landed there had been a Native American site and there was a lot of corn that was cached there. Why is it there? You know, they then understood once they got there that the Native Americans who were there were mostly decimated by disease. But they had all of these things that were stored up, and they happened to land at this place where there happened to be a lot of food that was already there, and they're getting there in November. Now, I don't like January winter in Kansas. I know I wouldn't like November winter in Massachusetts. But in getting acclimated in all of these things, and there happened to be a Native American, you know, Samoset, if you look at the language, or the history, and then you look at Squanto, who also showed up a little bit later. Squanto had made 4 trips across the Atlantic. This is in the early 1600s. Because he had been enslaved and caught and brought back. He wanted to get back. He was one of the survivors from that decimated tribe or settlement. Why does this European, acclimated, English-speaking Native American survivor from the decimated tribe happened to be there when the pilgrims land there. You just pile all of these things together. And we've all heard in history about how, okay, well, they were able to plant corn and use fish as fertilizer. And they always thought that that was Native American. Research has shown that that's probably European. The ability to grow corn, bring corn from Europe for one, and then fertilize with fish. Squanto had to have 4 trips. He finally made it back to the U.S. He's European educated in agriculture and so on, and he speaks English, and he's able to develop the compact that resulted in the first Thanksgiving, where the Native Americans who didn't speak English and the English-speaking people couldn't speak there, but there's one guy who happened to be there at all of this. Now, that to me, there's just a lot of things that are piling up there. So this happened to be, this happened to be, this happened to be. I personally look at that as providential and helping. Why did Roanoke not survive? Why did Plymouth and the Pilgrims survive? You just stack it up. I find things that are really, really interesting in that at least. You look at things in our life with all these things that we summarized before, and there was intention that was involved with all of the planning. Those intentions are disrupted and changed, resulting in the reroute that had to happen, or that did happen. The response to that was, as we talked about, the Mayflower Compact and their changes in plans, and once they get there, there's survival. Do we have intention, disruption, response, and survival in our lives? Yeah. How many times? For those of us that are older, there's a lot of intentions that I had. Whoop, that didn't happen. How do I adjust? How do I survive? We find things from history that we can learn from. And if we have a commitment and a faith that God's working in our lives, are we going to get through that a whole lot easier? Absolutely. I think in history and in talking about this, projects that are driven by ambition alone falter. And I'll throw out Roanoke with that, with Sir Walter Raleigh and the others who did that. Roanoke failed. That's a fact. Now, are the reasons that it failed? I'm leaning toward, a little their foundations and their organization and willing to work together may not have been as good. Those that humbly invoke providence endure, as we see in history. We're going to talk about 1607 and 1620. Those did survive. I'm finding providence had at least an aid in that. And I add, though imperfectly, because we're guys and gals. We're not very perfect. Lessons and scriptures that we can find from that. In Psalms 127, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Proverbs 16:18, and this is I'm getting a chill just thinking about this, and I'm not trying to emotionalize this at all. Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty look before a fall. There were 2 scriptures that I really remember growing up that my dad really ingrained into me, and this was one of them. The other one was Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sin will find you out. That one was in there. Proverbs 16:18. Do you know what my address in Abilene, Texas was? What do you think? It was 1618 before Campus Court. To me, that's just, just a little thing. It is. But that's one of the 2 scriptures. Daddy made sure if we were playing baseball, don't tell them you're going to beat them beforehand. Let your talking on the field do that for you. Let your play on the field do that for you. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty look before a fall. And if we have an intention that's based on God principles, we're going to have more of a foundation for success. James 4:13 through 15 is talking about, don't talk about tomorrow. We're just a mist. Rather say, if it's the Lord's will, if it's God's will, we'll do those things tomorrow. That's what James 4 is talking about. So the lesson, projects driven by ambition alone have a tendency to fail. If they're invoking God's providence, I think there's more of an ability for success. Both Scripture and history suggest that God resists self-sufficiency but sustains dependent stewardship. And those three scriptures there from Psalms, from the screen is from James. I can't see the J back there, sorry. James, 1 Peter, and Deuteronomy. I especially like Deuteronomy. Beware lest you say, well, it's my power that did this, or my hand caused this. And Moses said, you shall remember the Lord. It is he who gives you power. I think we learn these things from history plus the Bible. God's sovereignty explains how history moves forward. It does not excuse how people behave or are or will be judged. There was a tendency in a lot of cases to say, well, they must have been on God's side or they wouldn't have succeeded. Or what they did succeeded regardless of their motives and their methods, and have a tendency to look back at that and say that God approved it. And I'm just going to throw out the word slavery in that case. Would God ever be in favor of slavery? Absolutely not. A lot of things happened because of slavery, despite its evils. So we can't look back and say that, well, slavery was okay then, but it's not now. So you can't look back and talk about these things in Providence and talk about these things in history and say, well, they must have been okay, or they must have been approved because they were successful. So we can't really judge the motives and say, well, they were okay. So there's a tendency in history to do that, and I'm just raising that and saying that we can't go back and say those people were okay in doing those things. And there's further points on that. But when Paul was talking in Romans, and he's quoting what God was saying, I've raised you up, and he's talking to Pharaoh, really, for the very purpose of showing my power in you, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. Did God like what Pharaoh did? Absolutely not. Did God approve Pharaoh's actions? No, but he worked through him. God determines times and calls people to repent and to account, as Paul told the Athenians in Acts 17. And from one of the greatest Bible stories about Joseph, from Genesis 37 all the way to 50 and everything else, Joseph told his brothers, you meant this for evil. God meant it. And I like to say that God used it for good. Whether God meant for Joseph to be sold by his brothers, I can't really say that. But I can definitely say that God used it for good. And that's what Joseph was saying. God's purpose does not equal human innocence or justify what people did. God will use what people did for good. Providence means that God is never absent, not that God is always pleased. God's presence without divine approval is shown in that reference in Habakkuk. He will judge and discipline, and we're to be patient. There's all sorts of references in the Old Testament. Why do the evil prosper? Why do the evil get to do these things? And I'm trying to follow, but the evil prosper. There's all sorts of... God will work his will in time. We've just got to be patient. Psalms talks about God's nearness, and Judges, it talks about the anger of the Lord. The hand of the Lord was against them for evil. God was present during all of those times, and in his time, he'll discipline and judge and take care of things. I always think back to, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. And if you do that, I'm about 1.7 hours old in God's timing. You can do the math, and yours is not going to be much different from mine. Maybe a minute or two, or 10 minutes, or 20 minutes. You're about 20 or 30 minutes younger than I am. Maybe 40, but it's close. It's all in God's time. I'm 1.7 hours old in God's perspective. Projects driven by ambition alone. We talked about this before. I'm going to move from this. Some will try to find a lot of approval in the things that they've already done or the things that they think and try to justify it by, I have some special standing before God, or anything that I succeeded at must be evidence of God's approval. That's not necessarily the case. Were the Jews the chosen people? Absolutely yes. Did they abuse that and constantly fall away? Yes. So they had comfort. I'm chosen. I don't have to repent. Or I can be thankful that I'm chosen, but it's because of me. It's not because of God. There's all sorts of things that we can't look at past events and justify our present actions by what may have happened previously. There's personal accountability that we need to constantly look for in all the things that we do and be able to rest on biblical principles in what we believe and how we stand. I am not saying in this that America is superior to the exclusion of other countries. Not saying that at all, but I am advocating the fact that America has a higher base based on what's called the Judeo-Christian principles that this country was founded on. So we, I think, can shoot for a higher level of excellence. God works through brokenness, broken people, and not moral blamelessness. So I'm not saying, well, look at the outcome. We must have been right, either as a country or from our personal beliefs and personal things that happened in our life. And you can see that. God worked through the cross. Was there really good in the cross? If you're crucifying and killing, that's not good. Did God use it? Yes, all those things. We talked about Joseph. God used intended evil for good. We can look at kings and nations all throughout time. God used pride. God used Nebuchadnezzar. God used Ahab and Jezebel. So God works through brokenness and not moral innocence. There's all sorts of projects through time. Why did the Tower of Babel fail? It wasn't looking for God. They just wanted to exalt themselves and people. Abraham was told to leave and he left. Do you know where he was going? No. Saul's intentions were totally self-ambition versus David. David could have jumped and gone past Saul and taken over if he wanted to, couldn't he? But he was waiting on God in that case. There's all sorts of things. Projects driven by ambition alone will falter. Those that call on God for help have a tendency to endure, though imperfectly. God's hand isn't always seen in comfort, but it's often seen in what is forged under pressure. Providence isn't proved by smooth sailing. It's often recognized in how God uses disruption to form people and institutions. And there are scripture references for this that we can find. Again, I've got Joseph in talking about the lack of smooth sailing, all sorts of Hebrews 11, and Hebrews 12 examples. We could look at these scriptures. I'd encourage you to do that. But if you especially think of James 1, 2 through 4, when it says God's hand isn't always seen in comfort, what does James say? Count it all joy, brethren, when you face what? Various trials. He doesn't say if you face them. He says when you face them. So count it all joy when that happens. God's hand is there. We've seen timely rescues. This is another chapter that I don't have time to summarize, and I hope this is helpful. There are all sorts of cumulative coincidences or patterns of providence that are seen. And scripture references where we can see how God works that. If you're talking about timely rescues in weather, obviously we think of what? It's on the screen, and it should come to mind when you're thinking about something that happened with water just going this way and dry land coming out from underneath the water. You know, obviously God worked that miracle. When George Washington's army of 9,000 escaped British armies of 32,000 because of a series of weather events that just happened to work out at the right time and the right hour. Those things happen, and we can see those things in history. So is that a cumulative coincidence, or is that a pattern of providence? This reference in Daniel, and I'm done. He does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. None can stay his hand or say to him, what do you do? So how do we ensure our presence in God's providence?